All right. Welcome to another episode here of the Enneagram Observers podcast. Today, our topic is going to be, what is the best name for each type? Now, why does this even matter in the first place and deserve a whole podcast conversation? Well, to me, because as the saying goes, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And for many people, these type names are that first impression for the Enneagram. You learn about it, there are these types, and almost immediately these types have names like helper, observer, achiever, etc. And you see the circle with the 9 points and the names are on them, and that is the first impression.
And you're kind of drawn to one right away. Like if I'm being honest, the first time I saw it, I was like, ooh, I think I wanted to be like probably the achiever.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that sounds like a conversation we just had.
Yeah.
But yeah, so not only is that your first impression, like most always first impressions, that first impression then shapes your opinions and your interactions and your engagement with a person, or in this case, a system of knowledge from there on out. So I think it deserves a fair amount, at least, of consideration to think about what are these names conveying and how might they be interpreted, because there are benefits and drawbacks to immediately trying to convey a lot about the Enneagram with these type names on the circle. And for me, on the category of drawbacks, the first kind of obvious one is that trying to reduce something as vast as the archetypal possibilities of each point to like a singular type name runs the risk of making or leading people into some stereotypes or limited assumptions about each type or number and what it might be.
Yeah, it might give you like a one-dimensional understanding of the type.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a second drawback is I think that it gives people maybe a false sense of knowledge and familiarity with the system. And kind of what I mean by that is, right, you see the number, you see the type name, and you might immediately jump to typing yourself because we all have ideas about what it means to be an achiever or a loyalist. But let's contrast it with something like Myers-Briggs. Say in both cases, you're interested in the system, you hear it might have some benefit for you. You know nothing about Myers-Briggs. You look into Myers-Briggs, and all of a sudden you see stuff like INFJ or ENFP. Well, that's like a fairly meaningless acronym outside of any context. So if you really wanted to learn about it because you thought it had some benefit with you, you'd kind of have to respect the system and take some time to really learn it and see what the deeper meaning and the intentionality behind these acronyms are.
Right.
But for better or worse, with the Enneagram, you can kind of immediately just start to jump in and type yourself without really understanding the precedent behind these names. So that can be a drawback, but conversely, that can also be a benefit because
I think it makes it way more approachable than Myers-Briggs.
Exactly. Once you get into the Enneagram, there might be some jargon, directions of integration, disintegration, but at least that first impression is kind of free of jargon, and it talks about archetypes, which are just like this kind of universally thing that cross-culturally still show up. And they evoke the imagination and the intuition and stories and myth. And that's all really powerful stuff. So the Enneagram's got that going in its favor. All right. And then lastly, I think a benefit would just be as a teaching tool. Say you really do learn more about the Enneagram, you learn a vast amount of traits and behaviors and core motivations and all this stuff. Those names kind of give you a place to return to in an archetypal container to put all of that stuff and those beliefs back into that makes it easy to remember and maybe talk about.
Yeah, because the name is kind of like a symbol, right? So it's like it's a good symbol to encapsulate and return to all the ideas that you end up learning about in the Enneagram. Yeah.
Okay, so that's why this conversation is important, I think, to be had. Now let's talk about some considerations. What makes a good archetypal name for the Enneagram points? And I think the first and biggest one to me is you really have to walk a fine line between generality and specificity.
What do you mean by that, Elliot? Because I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, so there are 9 types. There aren't 3 types, there aren't 12 types. There are 9 types for a reason, and that's because while some of the types may share some similarities, there is something distinctly different that leads to the number 9. And when it comes to the Enneagram, that's because there are 9 core motivations, 9 fears and desires, which give rise to these 9 types. So you want a name that, and first of all, when we're talking about a good name, like this is no tall order. It's no easy task to try to encapsulate all this into a one-word name. But anyway, you want a name that is not too general. It's specific enough, I think, that most people would easily say, who are familiar with the Enneagram, yeah, that's that type. You can't make a good case for a certain name being, well, it could be that type. You know, it's wishy-washy. It could be that type, could be a different type. For example, there are 9 types, but there are 3 centers. So that's a different way of viewing the Enneagram. The thinking center, the feeling center, and the doing center. So we could have an archetypal name like the thinker or the doer.
The worker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there would be several types that could lay claim to that name. So it'd be a little too general and not specific enough to one of the 9 types. Now, kind of going off of that, on the other realm of specificity, we're trying to encapsulate a whole range of archetypal expression that comes out of a core motivation. So I think a bad name on the other side of specificity is something that kind of reduces this core motivation and archetypal potential into a certain role or a certain profession or a certain title. So if I said the archetype of the lawyer, what type or what point do you think that might be associated with?
3 or 6.
Okay. Not what I was thinking at all.
Oh, really? What were you thinking?
I was kind of going to go 1 on that.
Well, it depends, because I think it's are you a lawyer for what reason?
For the core motivation.
Yeah.
All right. So either way, we both have different rationales here, but either way, that is not a title or a profession is not a great archetypal name when it comes to the Enneagram either, because that'll bring me into the next point. If at all possible, again, no tall order, not always easy, a good archetypal name for the Enneagram would point back to the core motivation, because that is something so essential about understanding the Enneagram.
So could I say one that might be an example of something too specific?
Sure.
Which may be like, and I've heard this being used for this type, but like the artist,
Yes.
for example, because I mean, most people who are familiar with the Enneagram will probably know you'd be referring to the 4,
Yes.
but not all 4s are artists. I actually know quite a number of 4s who don't have really any artistic interest or ability.
Yeah, I think that is the most, the lawyer was a totally like stretch kind of example, but in terms of things that are actually used, I think for me as well, I think the artist totally fits in that too, a little too title or role specific to encapsulate the point. Particularly something so as unique and varied as type 4.
Oh, are they varied? I guess they are varied. I guess there are a bunch of different types of type 4s.
Anyway, we'll get to 4s in a bit, but to get back to the point, if at all possible, pointing back to the core motivation, or at least the essential strategy that a type uses regardless of their social role or function, I think is something that could make one of the names better than the others.
Okay.
And the third topic for consideration that I have is levels of health. Most Enneagram authors, although not all, the most common way to talk, this is a growth system, right? So there are different ways of engaging or relating with the core motivation. And as a result, we talk about different levels of health, most commonly 3-tiered. So unhealthy, average, and healthy. And I feel like another thing to consider is that some of these names, say by a given author, to me, maybe one type's name has a more negative connotation where like the unhealthy versions of that type take on that archetype. Whereas some other names, maybe by the same author or teacher, it has a more positive connotation where that archetype is really more so only expressed in healthy versions of the type.
That point is kind of difficult because it's like the connotation is subjective. So it's like if you think, reformer, which is to take number one, if that might have a connotation to someone and might have a positive one to someone else. So it's like, it's hard to say, but I get what you're saying. There are certain names that generally across the board will have a negative or a positive connotation.
I mean, that's a great point, because so much of what's the best archetypal name is kind of a subjective thing, which we're doing anyway to maybe see if we can agree on some truth or maybe disagree. Either way, I think it's going to be valuable to people.
Bro, actually, I'm going to say, I just thought of one, and maybe this is jumping the gun, but whatever, I'm going to roll with it. Like the title, the Social Justice Warrior, I think could be applied to one, and depending on who you say that to, that would be very charged in opposite ways. Like, it doesn't have a general connotation. It has pretty specific like audiences who would think like, yeah, that's me, and other people would be like, bro, that ain't me.
For sure. So I guess we can only share our experiences and see what we think of it.
I'm going to add a fourth one, thing that would make it a fourth set of criteria that would make it a good Enneagram title. This is my personal view of the Enneagram, but and I think I might have stolen this from Richard Rohr, but he always said that when you hear your type, it should kind of sting a little bit or humiliate you.
All right.
So I think the best Enneagram titles should sting the person they're meant for.
Okay, so maybe that means to my level of health thing, but because as its own point, maybe that means you like the titles that point more to the shadow, more to the unconscious pattern, more to the thing that you maybe don't want to admit to yourself, but comes along with the territory of being a certain type.
Yes, because I think that's more useful. And it's like, that's really what I think we should probably be using the Enneagram for, is to help us be more free from these like, traits that we get ourselves in. So it's like, I have seen a little bit of a culture in Enneagram culture of being like, I'm a 7. Ooh, like put it on my under my email. Brett Benka, like architect 7. Like, no, that's not, I don't think that's how it should be. You shouldn't really be hype about it. You should kind of be trying to break out of that.
This is a big, I think, area of discussion in the Enneagram.
INTJ, that's me. Like,
yeah. I'm looking forward to this being part of it. And I specifically think we keep coming to one. One's going to be first. I think this will be a good conversation point for one specifically.
Let's do it.
So we're almost there. We're almost there yet, but one final thing before we start discussing the actual types. Where are these names coming from? We're just going to discuss the source material a bit. The first and most common, I think, names that have been adopted in common Enneagram parlance would be the Riso Hudson of the Enneagram Institute, archetypal names. Those seem to be the most widely adopted these days. Not far behind, kind of a second place would be the Helen Palmer of the narrative tradition. I see those names a fair amount. So for each type, we'll discuss both of their names because there's no overlap. I did a little more digging, and I have some more not as common ones that I think still merit discussion. Maybe they're better. Maybe they're not as common for a reason, but we'll get into them. And the first one is from a book, The Literary Enneagram by Judith Searle, perhaps?
Probably Searle.
Yeah, right. Judith, get back to us on that. But
Judith!
I think there's actually... Most Enneagram books I never fully read, but I skim this. But I actually think this is a really good book, and I really like one of her names at least that she's put on the table, and she does also mention that she's one in the book. So whenever interested, it's interesting to know. But anyway, that's one source of names that we'll consider. Another one is by an author called Karen Webb, who talks about, there's a foreword from Helen Palmer, so she's a student of Helen Palmer. So a fair amount of her names actually overlap with Palmer's, so we won't mention her in those cases, but she does have some that diverge from Palmer, so we'll discuss those names when they come up. The kind of oddball of the mix, I think, is Hurley Dobson names that they've suggested. many of which I really hadn't encountered until I kind of came across this book. I don't see them commonly used, but they could be interesting to discuss nonetheless. And then, so that's the names we're going to discuss. And then as a point of reference, I think I mentioned in the introduction, we don't always have to discuss type names or types when we're using the Enneagram. We can map different things onto it. And one approach taken by Richard Rohr, who you mentioned, and Ebert in their book, The Enneagram, A Christian Perspective.
No, really, not Siskel and Ebert. Different Ebert. Right?
Correct.
All right.
That's some Seven humor to break up the oneness of Richard Rohr, I guess.
Yes.
But anyway, the approach there would be to map things like the need to ... and then explain that for each point. For example, 1, the need to be perfect. 2, the need to be needed, etc. And I really like that approach because it immediately gets rid of that kind of stereotype characterization thing and kind of cuts to the heart of the matter. And to your point about liking a name that kind of exposes you in a sense, the need to succeed, to be special, to avoid pain, the Rohr approach of the need to kind of does that. And then finally, to give some background for where these names come from, and we said we'd judge them against maybe the core motivation or the core thing that makes a type a type. Another thing I actually did when I made my website was for each point, I just put the core motivation on. So for 1, I put virtue, integrity, for 6, knowledge, competence, and so on and so forth.
For 5, knowledge and competence.
Yes, that's why we're a team here, and that's why you're here. Thank you.
Bro, I was also going to correct you. You said no tall order a few times. I think it's no small order.
Whew, okay, yeah.
That's why Elliot pays me the big bucks to correct him.
I like cliches, but I probably just I don't know. I don't use them well. But anyway, okay.
I'm itching to go, Elliot. Let's fucking do this. Can I swear on here? Do we need to bleep that out? We can bleep it out.
To be
later.
determined. Right. Can I make one final point here, which maybe we'll cut out if it's not worthy, but.
Sure.
Particularly on some of these authors that I mentioned, I don't know that you've read the books. You're probably not super familiar with them.
No.
To be honest, some of them I've just skimmed. So we're not maybe going to do the author like justice in terms of totally hitting on what they intended when they decided to name a certain type by a certain name. But I think that's okay for this discussion because it's, again, about what do people get as a first impression and what name gives the best, or at least as a consideration, what name gives the best first impression.
Yeah, no one except like super Enneagram nerds are really going to care. Like, oh, that's actually came from Palmer. That came from Searle.
Right, but what I mean by that is these names have an impact. And back in the day, when the Enneagram was getting popularized in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the teachers or the authors came up with the names. And I think they kind of knew that it would be in a context where, whether it be a book or a seminar, they'd get to share the name, but they'd also get to share a lot of information about the type, their rationale for the name, etc. But we're not in that day anymore. We're in the day of Instagram and TikTok and YouTube Shorts. So in a lot of cases, people are getting exposed to these names without maybe the original context or the original rationale.
All right, fair enough.
So that's the point I wanted to make. And now you're itching to go for it. Now we will go for it. All right, type 1, Brett. We have the Riso Hudson has the reformer. Helen Palmer has the perfectionist. Other names we have are the critic, the achiever, and I heard a grunt there. Rohr and Ebert say this is the need to be perfect, and the core motivation of 1 centers around the themes of virtue and integrity.
Yes.
So, all right. So you got the names there. What do you think of them?
I think the best one is the critic, hands down. And that's because I think I think it would sting a 1 to be called a critic.
Yeah.
And I also have heard, and I think this is a good metric to find out if you or someone you know is a type 1. Maybe you're like, oh, I don't know if they're type 1 or type 2. There's kind of a good A/B test, which is, do you have a constant inner critic?
Yeah.
And that's what I think the heart of the type 1 is like, and I think both of us, if we're being honest, have been rubbed the wrong way by ones in the past. I mean, they're kind of they're a type that's like hard for me to understand, because you kind of see them and they make these statements like, this is what it should be. It should be this. No, it should be this way. That's too much this way. And I'm like, bro, where are you getting this from? And it's like, it's actually coming from like their gut. They're like deep in their, like some deep place, but I turned off that part of me, or like I always want like some kind of reason, like evidence-based, or maybe you just say, I just feel this way. It's like my personal take on it. And for the ones, they always have this like really strong conviction, and I'm looking for like where it's coming from, and I can't really see it. But where it actually is coming from, and this made me see them in a little bit of a softer light, is they have, as hard as they are on the world, I think their inner critic is as hard on them.
Okay.
And so that's why I think critic is just a great word. It summarizes them externally, but also internally. So
that's a great point. I don't know if we explicitly said that, but if the title or the name can, I think, do double duty and describe the external and the external, that's very good. I think you brought up some great points. And as I mentioned earlier, but maybe more appropriate to mention here, the author, that literary Enneagram Judith S., admits to being a 1 early on in the book. So she came up with that name. So
okay.
So that's a 1 name.
And Richard Rohr is also a 1.
Yes. And in the intro to that book, she does mention the experience of not wanting to be a 1, I'm a 1.
Yeah.
Like that kind of repulsion to it, which I don't think every type has, but
well, I'm gonna throw out another name that like has a negative connotation, but I think it's important. I would almost think of it like the Puritan is a 1, and it's like I suppose that is a subset of a certain type of ones.
Yeah. But
if you apply it to like, they're a health Puritan, or they're I don't know. I think you could apply it in different ways, and I think it resonates with me because that's how that's how they feel to me whenever I'm around ones. I always kind of feel like, oh, I got to kind of like walk a little bit on eggshells because I don't want to step on one of their like sacred cows.
Yeah. I think totally fair if you're going to do the disclaimers, like it's not necessarily always the moral Puritan in the traditional Christian religious sense, although that certainly is one of the subtypes of 1, but a health Puritan, or you mentioned the social justice warrior. So the Puritan in a more,
I'll just call it morally. Yeah. They're moral Puritans.
So that's fair. Yeah.
But is that okay? Is it always related to, so, people sometimes say the perfectionist, and that I think is an okay title for it, but there's like, you can be a perfectionist for a number of reasons. And I don't think, like 3s, I think, can be perfectionists. 6s can be perfectionists. 2s can, actually a lot of types.
Certainly 5s with the competence thing can look like perfectionism.
But there's like, it always seems like there's a moral component, or like a moral adjacent component. Like it's like,
yes, I feel like, again, no single word name is perfect and needs some asterisk. And I do like, and I think the perfectionist title works if it does have that explanation that it relates more to a sense of like moral, virtuous, perfection, etc.
Yeah. So I don't know. Does it? I think we're in agreement though that the core motivation is something to do with virtues, integrity, morals. It's like it's always in that area. It might not have to be moral, but like so someone, you could say a 1 who's a critic or a perfectionist would have to have their desk like perfectly clean, but it's because it's like cleanliness is close to godliness type of thing.
For sure. Yeah. I love that quote. That's a super 1 thing. I think you've shared some good opinions about this. Let me kind of wrap up some thoughts on some of the other names here.
All right.
You had a grunt at achiever. Yeah, and I didn't particularly care for it either. Too general, and if we said easily confused with another type, there's a ton of people who call threes the achiever, and I think that's a decent name for three. So I read that part of the book because I wanted to see where the author was coming from, and it doesn't make like a strong case specifically for achiever other than one stuff. Like they make to-do lists and they kind of follow through on tasks.
Again, I might agree with it if there was a adjective like the moral achiever or something, or something like that.
Yeah, but that one just it crosses into three territory too much for sure.
Not a fan.
All right, so now I want to talk about reformer and perfectionist. And
reformer is pretty good too. Actually.
Yeah, so that comes into the connotation. First of all, we mentioned like the sinking feeling. And I think one thing of note for me is
a sinking feeling, like ones have a sinking feeling
of like being a certain type and maybe knowing that's a certain type. And I don't know if you've come across this, but to me, if there's like any type that is most resistant to being their type, it's ones.
I think I would agree.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So then there's something furthermore I want to go with that is that I think that perfectionist probably has more of a negative connotation. Would you agree? Like it's not a great thing to be a perfectionist.
Yeah, it's gently negative. Yeah.
Yeah. And reformer to me has a positive connotation to it. Okay. All right. Good enough.
As long as like I'm not the subject of the reforming.
Yeah. Yeah. So then I think the conversation to have there, or at least something to think about is, and you can make a case for either way, but it's like, do you want to give people like the thing that makes them crawl, or one, the virtue type who likes to aim for an ideal? Do you want to maybe make them aware of what the ideal is for that certain type? And I think reformer speaks to a little bit of the one ideal, you know, to get out of just being the critic or to get out of just being the perfectionist. So you can do different things with the archetypes. And one is to point out, hey, this is what you got to look at. Or another powerful thing of archetypes is to give something people to strive for, something to emulate. And I'm not going to do this with every type, but I thought at least for one, to some of these issues that we're talking about here, you know, needing more explanation or different levels of help, my solution to this whole archetypal game of the Enneagram and trying to specificity, generality, levels of health was actually just to create like 3 archetypes for each type. Because I think it's still simple enough. It's not too complex, but I think it just conveys so much more information about levels of health and core motivation.
And I like what you said, that it gives you something that will sting a little bit, and then it'll give you something to kind of look forward to, which is important because, you know, you need reformers and you need people who like feel something is right in their gut and who aren't afraid to say that kind of stuff. And it's like, so if basically I'm agreeing with your kind of 3-pronged approach of giving 3 levels of health, 3 different titles for each type.
Yeah. So again, we're not going to do this for every type because I think it could be a separate episode, but to just introduce the concept and what it could do from some of the things we're talking about today, you know, I basically chose an archetypal name and that kind of describes maybe the more outer expression. And then we talked about the inner expression. So I just put an adjective in front of the name. And for ones, I have the idealistic zealot. For the lowest level.
Okay.
For the middle level, the self-critical perfectionist.
Okay, still good.
And then for the highest level, the humble, humane reformer.
Humble, humane reformer. Could you have just used one?
I guess I didn't just use one adjective there.
Humble reformer? I would have just stuck with humble reformer.
Fair enough. But the idea is like right at the first level, you have your ideals, you have your virtues, but you're to that Puritan sense, you're just projecting that anger, flawed perspective out onto the world. And the problem is always with someone else. And it's just simple black and white. You're the problem. And if you could only change to my way, everything would just be fine. So frickin' get on.
Yeah, I just picture someone with like, kind of like a nun with a ruler, just like going after the world though. Like, you need to repent. It's your best sinners. Yeah.
And then for the average level, that kind of criticism, the critic, it kind of comes back on the self. Like, where are my flaws? Where am I not where I need to be? The inner critic, yada, yada, et cetera. We won't go too deep here. And then to me, the humble humane, or just the humble reformer, speaks to some integration of the points that it's connected to and something to strive for. And I think can be summed up in like the Martin Luther King quote: you can't drive out darkness with darkness, only with light. You can't beat hate with hate, only with love. That kind of idea.
And I don't know if Gandhi was the one, but I think that "be the change you wish to see in the world" is a good, like, healthy one quote.
Exactly. So, all right, I think we've given a lot of attention here to one and that kind of idea, but we'll keep moving. But yeah, all right, that's the terrain we're talking about here.
All right.
On to two. For archetypes, we have the helper, the giver, the lover. And for Rohr and Ebert, the need to be needed. I need you. Cheap Trick.
I want you to want me.
Yeah. I need you to need me. And the core motivation of love and appreciation. And Brett, I might add that you're married to a 2.
Yes.
So you should be totally qualified to lay down the final opinion about what is the best archetypal name for 2. What do you think?
I think it's the helper.
Okay.
And it has, I think in general, people think of helper as a positive term, and I think it is positive, but I can think of ways that it could be negative. And the one issue I have with all of these names is there's kind of like, and 2s are very sneaky about it. There's a very subtle, they always help you, and it seems like it's for free. It seems like it's out of the goodness of their heart, but if they're being honest with themselves, there's a little invoice that they keep after they help you. And it's like, I think that would be my only critique of all of these names. None of them really give that to me, but insofar as I know them and understand them and love them, I think the helper is a pretty good name.
Yeah, that to me is kind of the main point. And I agree with you. Helper's my favorite name as well. Just to talk about a couple things more specifically. Lover, obviously we have the core motivation for love. Lover to me speaks a little too specifically to maybe like the subtype or the sexual one, because you can have 2s that need to be loved and appreciated happens almost only in like a social context, like a nurse or kind of Mother Teresa archetype, a social context where it's not like this one-on-one relationship dynamic. So lover maybe speaks a little too much to that.
Not
to me.
as big of a fan of lover. Yeah.
And again, to be fair, that comes from the literary Enneagram book, and she does talk about the subtype. So this isn't like the author doesn't know her stuff. This is just how the name may be interpreted. And I think that's a limitation of the lover archetype. And then to your point, comparing the helper and the giver, I thought, yes, if we're going to talk about 2, it's a good thing to kind of hint at the idea that there's helping or there's giving happening, but there's a string attached or there's an expectation. And to me, the word giver almost has less of that connotation, like a pure gift, right? With no string attached, where help seem more than giver. Helper seems to at least convey a little of that strings attached thing with it. Yeah.
And even like, do you need help? Like even that question to me, generally I don't mind being asked that question, but sometimes it's like there's a little, I don't want to say it stings, but there's a little bit of like why are you asking me this?
Yeah.
And like, do I look like someone who needs help? Like there's some other, all I'm saying is there's some maybe subtle shadows within the term helper and within the term help, which I think we agree with. Nice. So yeah.
I like it. All right. I think that's a good, again, you're the authority, you're the expert on this matter, Brett. So
I am the authority.
All right. On to 3, which I guess maybe you're also somewhat of authority on, since we seem to discuss a little.
A little background. If I'm not a 3, I'm definitely identifying with it at the moment. Yes. And I think outwardly in the world, I behave as a 3. I don't really, a lot of times I don't feel like that's who I really am, but to the outside world, I think I would look like that. But
All
let's
right.
let's go.
So
with
the
it.
names we have here are achiever, performer, succeeder, and the need to succeed with a core motivation centering around themes of recognition and value. I feel all of the names are pretty similar, but does one edge it out for you?
One is a lot better than the other ones.
Okay.
And it's because it stings a little bit. Let's see. Would you be able to guess?
Okay. I think where you're going at this and where I would probably also go is, now let me finish this thought because I'm going to take it somewhere different than where I'm starting. On the surface, I almost like performer the least as a name because to the idea of like all fours aren't artists, if you think narrowly of performer as like, oh, someone on stage who's singing or dancing or acting, you're like, okay, but there can be threes in the boardroom or there can be threes elsewhere. And, you know, that name is too focused on a certain role at the expense of others.
It could conjure a very specific image.
But so in that sense, it's maybe the worst name because it's too, but it could also become the best name to me if you look at it this way. Whether they're on stage performing in a literal sense, something about the three strategy has an element of performance, of being a social chameleon, of wearing that persona and performing to be recognized, performing to be successful, performing to be valued, whether or not, again, you're a literal performer. So where I think that performer name touches a little deeper on the three strategy in a way that achiever and succeeder don't necessarily do.
You nailed it. I think performer is the best one.
Okay.
And I see how you would say maybe it's the least appropriate if it conjures the images of like, you know, show tunes performing, you know, on stage. But there's something always, and this word's going to sound harsh, but there's something a little bit deceitful about almost everything a three does.
Loaded.
I told you it was going to sound harsh, but there's like where you're saying, oh, they're always performing. Like if they're performing, and a lot of times they get so I get so good at it that we like, that it comes out at a subconscious level, but it's like any even just like one-on-one conversation, there's like a little bit of a tailoring that's happening. Like I think it's almost impossible, at least when you're starting out on this like soul searching journey, for a three to just be like, hey, just be yourself. That they'd be like, what? Like they would like short circuit their brain because there's always some level of what's the audience? How can I perform for the audience? And it's like that. I think a lot of threes, when they hear this, they'll admit that to themselves if they're being honest. But there's I think it's there all the time. It's like every interaction, and even to themselves, I think a lot, even thoughts, like if you're looking at like that's why, and there's another reason why I kind of have had some kinship with threes as of late. It's like when I was thinking about Enneagram tests and Myers-Briggs tests, that kind of short circuits my own brain because I know when I read a question, I know what they're asking and I know what I want to answer. So like, I'm kind of like tailoring my answer to the audience, which is I'm performing for me too. Like, I'm like, oh, well, Brett wants to hear this about himself. So maybe I'm more of that one. Like that's happening in my brain. So basically all I'm saying is performer is a great word. Runs through everything threes do. And that's what I'm answering.
Fair enough. I want, and on note, the like traditional Enneagram espoused by Oscar Ichazo, you know, largely credited for the whole Enneagram personality thing, does go into, I may get the specific words here, is like the passions, the holy ideas, the vices, the virtues. And you said deceit is a strong word, but I do believe that's actually the word that he used for like the passion fixation of three. But then the holy idea, the thing that they have to integrate is truthfulness. And so everything you said is true, but always when we give those harsh things, I want to point out that that describes the struggle. And the temptation or the fixation, but it's not always true. And it is something that is part of the growth path of 3. And they, it's not baked into 3. So I don't, not create a stereotype or that kind of thing where if you go about this consciously, you can understand that and not be that.
Right.
So
I'm gonna just try to add a positive spin too, because I think it's important to say one of each, something negative and something positive. But like even though 3s are always performing, like I've found when there is someone under the performance, and it's like whoever that is usually a pretty sweet, soft, like emotionally sensitive person.
A heart type.
Yeah, they're a heart type.
Yeah.
But it's like I think that's their inner journey is trying to get in touch with that, and it's pretty cool when you see it happen. Even in like I'm gonna give an example from TV, but like Mad Men, Don Draper, I think is a 3. Anyone who's seen this advertising guy, it's perfect career for a 3. But you see little glimpses of like the soft, kind of emotionally sensitive person that Don Draper actually is, and it's like, oh yeah, that's nice. Like powerful,
Yeah, I have a personal example that I can think of for that too. So nicely done. All right. Good redemption.
I'm gonna move on and take the next one, and I'll read them off, and we'll flip roles.
All right, fair enough.
Okay. So for this type 4, it has been called the individualist, the romantic, the aesthete, and the Rohr and Ebert Christian perspective is the need to be special or unique, and the core motivation is to be unique, to have you have written down here meaning.
Themes of uniqueness and meaning, to find meaning, to define your uniqueness.
Okay, and you have your own name for this type.
Well, of course,
which we can talk.
I will get to that.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, out of these, let's say if I had to force you to take either
for sure.
individualist, romantic, or aesthete, what would you pick?
So to something you said, I didn't find like the specific person who came up with artist, but that one has been thrown around. So for me, when we're coming up for a name for type 4, I think there's 2 general archetypes we have to account for that come out of 4. One of them is the artist, and perhaps the eccentric artist, the poets, the bohemians, the gypsies, etc. But another broad category that comes out of 4 is the healer. People who maybe identify as empaths, psychotherapists, social workers, compassionate heart types who...
I'm so special, like I can feel the world's emotions.
Yes. So some of these names speak more to that artist, but they kind of leave the healer in the dust. So as one kind of the general criteria I have in mind for a good 4 name is, it would be good if it can address both of them. The romantic, to me, I don't know, candlelight dinners, images of that, or maybe it just, again, it speaks a little too much to the artistic side and not enough to the healer side for me. So that's not my favorite.
Okay.
I'm going to skip around a little bit. Let's go to individualist. If you don't give any explanation, there's a couple ways I think that can be very misleading. When I hear individualism, individualist, you might think like philosophically, individualism versus collectivism, which is really more that philosophy comes up around point 6. Like, are you a sovereign, free-minded, free-thinking individual?
I didn't even think of that, but yeah, I think it's safe to say we both went through kind of a Ron Paul phase, a libertarian phase, and that.
Yeah, so
I didn't even think of that in terms of
individualist is very associated with themes of point 6.
Okay,
and also if you hear individualist, you might think about rugged individualism, every man for himself, and that's a very 8 approach.
I don't need anyone else. I'm an individual. Yeah, okay.
And furthermore, so if an empath, someone who I feel very connected, I'm concerned about others' well-being, hears the name individualist, there might be, it might seem very misleading, like, I'm not just for myself, I'm always there when someone needs me. So with that said, without any explanation, those are kind of the traps of the name individualist. But if we give the explanation that the archetype of the 4 is something that is concerned with finding my personal uniqueness, my most authentic, true to me, individual creative expression, then it's like, okay, the individualist works because 4s are very concerned with finding something that's maybe true to me, something that hasn't been done, isn't commonplace. So with a little bit of an asterisk, the name individualist works.
But I'm confused. So is that your answer? If I had to make you pick between those three?
No, I'm getting to it. I almost, until I came up with my own, I think I liked the aesthete because it speaks to an appreciation of art and beauty, a sensitivity that I think works for either the artist or the healer aspects of 4. That sensitivity and appreciation of beauty.
Yeah, so, even the psychic healer kind of 4, I think would still resonate with aesthete.
Yes.
Yeah. Even though they might not work in any type of like artistic realm or anything with aesthetics, it's still like aesthetic adjacent. It's like vibes, man. You know, like they're very particular about vibes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what the aesthete is. So would that be your answer? I'm pressing you to answer first before you get to your own.
Prior to my own, I would choose aesthete.
Okay.
Prior to coming up with my own.
I think I'd agree.
Okay. Cool. And then I guess it's a very 4 thing. For all the other names, I felt that the other authors were kind of...
Elliot had to make his own unique name for a 4.
You know, for the other ones, when I was doing my website, I'm like, I prefer the Reformer for 1. I prefer the Helper for 2. But for 4, I was just like, none of these names are really doing it for me. What's my own unique contribution that I can bring to the Enneagram world? So here we go. Hear me out. The Alchemist.
The Alchemist. I like it. Maybe I like it a little too much. And by that, I mean, I don't know if there's a negative connotation for an alchemist. Could it sting? Could a 4 hear I think you could say that to almost all 4s and they'd be like, yeah, man. Yeah.
I think you're right. If I was to critique my own idea, it doesn't, whereas the individualist kind of speaks to the point that might sting a little bit about trying to be unique, trying to be special, you're just trying too hard to be different rather than letting it happen. The Alchemist might not speak to some of the stuff that 4s need to be aware of with their type and the territory. But what it does to me is it speaks to the deeper essential function of 4, which is, okay, going off of that aesthete theme, that sensitivity.
Sensitivity to vibes. I really like the term vibes with 4.
Yeah, sensitivity to pain. 4 is where, and again, if we take the Enneagram out of you're just this type, and we take it as these types are potentials or things that work within you, 4 is where a certain type of person, but anyone has to go to just feel their pain, feel their suffering. You go to 7 if you want to avoid it. But
right, that's a great point.
But when you need to feel your pain and suffering and heal it, that's what 4 is about, just that raw sensitivity to it. And then
not only raw sensitivity, but if I might add, almost like basking in the, or like...
That is another downside. So, okay, so maybe it does... No, it doesn't speak to it, but yes, that is a downside for basking in it. But to then that point, okay, there's gifts in it. So the poet Rumi is like very 4, and
were you going to relate him to alchemists?
I forget a quote that I wanted to say, but again, poetry, something about like turning your wound is where your beauty. I'm messing it up.
Like I know what you're saying. It's like beauty shines through the wound. Something like that. So Alchemist, this is where you're coming to feel your pain, but if you do it, and if you own it, and if you see it, you can transform it into something, and you can transform it into a transcendental work of art that touches people and transforms them. Or you can just transform it into a self-awareness that allows you to be an effective psychotherapist or something. So in either case, I like conveying the idea that
at some point of being a human, you have to feel your feelings and feel your pain and walk with it and not avoid it. But if you do, there's that hugely transformative ability to alchemize it into something beautiful, to find meaning in the suffering and maybe find a way to help people with, to justify their suffering in life.
For sure.
So the way to justify that and find meaning and beauty in it. And so that's why I like
I think it's a
Alchemist.
great name for pretty much all of the fours. Yeah, actually their gifts and their downsides. They can be alchemized into something maybe more beautiful or more useful. And I will say, I was thinking, because I put on my negative thinking cap and I was like, how can I turn alchemist into something negative?
Yeah.
It would be negative if you were at like, a productivity focused efficiency board meeting and you're like, and you look over and you see like an alchemist there, I'd be like, oh God.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just what we need. Someone who's like gonna talk about like their feelings and their vibes and like transcend. Like, no, we're trying to get some shit done, bro.
Yeah.
In that sense, an alchemist is kind of negative. So, all right, I'm cool with it. I think it's good.
All right. Well, I'm glad to have your stamp of approval, Brett. All right. On to fives.
Is it back in my court?
Back in your court, we have the investigator, the observer, the analyst, the need to perceive or understand, and core motivational themes that center around competence and knowledge.
Okay.
What do you think?
I'm going to do this a little backwards. I'm going to add my own because I still have my negative thinking cap on.
Ooh, okay.
I'm going to add this one. I'm going to add the autist.
Oh God.
Short for person with autism. And hey, it's 2023. That term's being thrown around.
Okay.
Get used to it. I say it with love. But if I had to pick from
you're going to have to convince me and explain that one to me.
Oh God, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Just ask a 5 about anything they're interested in, and you're gonna get a dose of autism. Like, just endless facts, endless like context for those facts, and someone's just gonna be. And it has inside the world of a 5, it's very vibrant, but like to the person it is being explained to, it feels very dry a lot of times. Do you buy it? Do you buy my term now, or is it you still not on board?
I buy your rationale, but I'm worried that this podcast is never going to get sponsored. No.
Okay, we can bleep that out. Whatever.
Maybe we can call it the stamp collector or something.
The train enthusiast. We'll call it the train enthusiast.
The penny hoarder. I don't know.
Okay, but of the ones you have given me, I think the observer is the best one, and that's again because I think it feels neutral at the start, but if you look, I think it has built into the name a positive and a negative. And I think the positive is, I think when I hear observer, maybe this is just me, but I think of someone who is, there's some level of objectivity that comes to mind when I think of someone just observing. They're not partaking, they're not getting their hands dirty, they're not interfering with what's going on. There's kind of like a distance, and I think that can be a really powerful gift. But on the same token, it also implies that the observer is in the stands, they're in the audience, they're not partaking in the activity,
not involved.
They are people who are super smart, have great insight, observations, but they don't. I almost feel like there seems like a lack of full. There's like wasted potential that I almost want to see in 5s because they observe so much and they don't.
I like that.
They don't move into the action center. And they could go, their whole lives and know all this knowledge, have all like these facts, super smart people, super knowledgeable, super competent. But I'm like, what did you do with it, bro? Like, you're this old, knowledgeable person. And it kind of hurts a little bit to see someone who maybe they could have changed the world with all their knowledge, and they just were content to observe from a distance.
Nice. I also like the observer. I wasn't necessarily going to go where you went with it, but that's why I'm glad we're doing this, because I like everything you said there, to add also to what I like about the observer. And maybe it does actually, we'll find a way to mend our two rationales here a bit. So let's go down that train. Yeah.
A train enthusiast. My ears perked up. I'm like, train?
Yeah. So
I mean, we both have ties to this number, so we say it with love.
All right.
All right.
So I like the observer because it has the opportunity to me to bring it a little deeper into the 5 essence than the other names like investigator or analyst.
Which I think are both okay. I think they're okay.
They're okay,
Yeah.
but they're a little more specific, and I don't think, here's what I mean by that. Almost as a first strategy of 5, you have this taking a step back and observing.
Mm-hmm.
And one place that can go is a more intense cerebral, I'm going from observing to analyzing and investigating and fully putting my mental
There's more of
energy
an intensity in those
into
words,
it.
right?
Yeah. And that's one place you can go from observation to that. But observation can also just step back even further and detach more and be that pure kind of witnessing energy, which I think if we're going to talk about some of what 5 brings to the table in essence or in like the best part, if we take that observation, it's more easily to take that tie in with certain spiritual principles, Buddhist ideas of being the witness or being aware of awareness.
Oh yeah, there's heavy 5 energy in Buddhism, I think.
Yeah, so the idea that what 5 offers as the observer is that a non-attached witness vibe, I think is good to convey about 5 if you can. And perhaps you could say on the downside to some of the things you said about 5, that 5s can become attached to the detachment component of non-attachment. If we think of
it's a good like that makes perfect sense to me, but I could see someone being like, what?
So if we think of non-attachment as like non-attachment as detachment and compassion, 5s get that stepping back, detached, non-observation, but then there's that fear of being overwhelmed that stops them from the compassion that could arise and the action that could arise out of taking that step back.
Yeah, like it's too, like as I've learned more about the Enneagram, there's some like vibes have become more of the way I relate to it. So I see the 5 energy when you're talking about like it's either afraid or it doesn't want to get his or her hands dirty. It's like it almost feels like it's too hot. It's like it's too hot in the kitchen for 5s to actually go do some work and to get involved.
Yeah.
So I just derailed your train, started using another train metaphor, but what I had to
That was
get it out.
Mostly it, but okay, so 5s get the detachment, they don't get the compassion, or even in more principles. I know we both read David Data at a certain time and talking about masculine essence being the pure consciousness, and like that's 5s too, but so they get Shiva, but they don't get Shakti, the heart, the compassion, the energy,
the power, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The getting the hands dirty metaphor that you use. So again, to me, observer makes it easy to talk about these much deeper principles. It's a better word to start exploring that kind of territory that we've just gone down, and just analyst is a little more one-dimensional.
I agree.
So I like observer for that. All right.
Moving on to the 6 territory. This is in your court, so we'll read them off and we'll see which one you vibe with, you know? So we have the loyalist, the loyal skeptic, the pessimist, the questioner, or the guardian. Ooh, we have 5 actually pretty good ones in my opinion.
So this is one of note where all of the authors that we potentially pulled from had different names, so there's a lot to perhaps consider here.
Okay. And we'll just briefly say the Christian, the Richard Rohr and Ebert Christian perspective is the need to be certain or secure. And the core motivations are security and support.
Yes. All right. The main principle I think to keep in mind when we're talking about 6 is generally 6 is divided into like two subtypes of six. We have the counterphobic and the phobic varieties. And six is a fear type, the heightening of fear. And I think of it like this. All types have this core fear and desire thing going on. And it's like a core fear of this or that. So metaphorically, it's like a phobia. You have a fear of heights, or you have a fear of speaking in public. And that's what the types have. They have a like specific fear of something. To use that analogy further, six is generalized anxiety disorder. It's a little more open fear of just, well, sometimes we're not really sure.
Yeah, exactly. I think most times sixes aren't sure what they're afraid of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then two strategies arise out of this. The flight or the fight response, which
Is associated with the counterphobic.
the counterphobic,
and the flight.
maybe a more vigilante type of approach, or intellectually an intense skepticism and tearing down of ideas, or the flight or the flee, looking to groups, looking to belief systems,
And that would
looking
be-
to institutions, looking to flee into something.
Into security. Yeah.
Yes,
and that would be the
exactly.
phobic type.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I want to point this out. Like, we have these differences, and six is kind of the only type that gets this subtype meaning. But to some degree, I feel like counterphobic is 6 wing 5, and phobic is 6 wing 7.
If that feels right,
I think there's still value in saying six is unique in this dichotomy where other types aren't. But just for the web association thing, I do want to say that counterphobic leans a little more 6 wing 5 to me,
and
etc.
If I could interject, I think, like, again, I understand Enneagram types now is almost like how they feel to me, where it's like a counterphobic, the 6 wing 5 kind of feels a little colder, and the phobic 6 wing 7 feels a little warmer. It's like a friendlier vibe.
For sure. So why we go through all this, just one criteria, I think, when we're thinking of these names, does it hit on the two different aspects of the six, or does one name maybe more preferentially relate to one of the names? Well, then maybe it's not the best name, because we have to account for the wide variety that we can see in six due to these two subtypes.
Mm-hmm. So we have 5 here, though.
Yeah. So for me, Loyalist speaks largely to the phobic or the flee part, because the downside there and the trap there is fleeing to a group, an institution, a belief system, and then being loyal to it to a fault in some way.
So Elliot's crossing off Loyalist.
Not my favorite for that reason. Again, you could say even skeptics or counterphobics are loyal to their ideas, like an atheist or a scientific materialist being so loyal to materialism that they're anyway. But
Didn't we both go through an atheist phase at the same time too?
well, yes, we did. So that's what. So you can make the case that loyalist applies to both, but case in point, I like loyal skeptic, because
Oh, you do like loyal skeptic.
skeptic to me strongly speaks to the counterphobic aspect.
Do you even need the word loyal then? Could it just be the skeptic?
But then skeptic on its own really only speaks to me to the counterphobic perspective, because the type of phobic, now again, you can't be overgeneralized here, but one of the downsides of some six is just being loyal to a fault, just believing to a fault.
But is it like, I actually think the skeptic could be describing phobic sixes, because what looks like loyalty, or like, a clinging on, I actually think is a pushing against, is a skeptic, like where it might be like loyalty to your group, I actually think is a skepticism of your own individualism.
Okay. Didn't think of that one. Fair enough.
So I do like skeptic too, to give my own take. I'm surprised you didn't pick questioner, because I think the heart of what sixes deal with is questioning everything. excluding especially themselves, and then they kind of turn in on themselves where they'll start questioning their own questions and will question their questions of their questions. It's like it's in this question spiral.
You know what? I mean that's a great point. Again, I think I gravitated towards loyal skeptic because it was the one name where I was willing to give two components because we have two types. So, but that's a more surface level thing. But I think you make a great case for questioner maybe speaking to something deep and fundamental about the six pattern.
I think if we could probably both agree that each of these names would be better served with 2 words. The one word is really hard to encapsulate something. Like the 2 words is really great. And that's maybe what attracted you to loyal skeptic. And I think it's a good name, but if we're trying to do 1 word, I'd maybe push back and I would pick questioner, but I think these are all decent. The Guardian, how do you feel about that? For a 6, obviously.
It works. There's certainly a rootedness in tradition. I think on the counterphobic side, the 8, guarding against irrational beliefs, we're keeping science, rationality in the forefront, and we have to guard. So there's that energy.
And like guarding, did you say traditions?
Or yeah, tradition. And then on the phobic side, guarding, well, one of the places comes up is the Enneagram Christian or not, and is the Enneagram acceptable? And you have people like Rorgan making the case, but there's a lot of backlash because I think a lot of traditional Christians are also 6s. So there's a lot of backlash. Like, this is not part of the traditional teaching. This is not acceptable. This is not allowed. They're strict guardians of the faith, and there's not much room for allowing new or other maybe complementary ideas in. And so guarding belief systems very closely.
Man, as we're talking about this, there's just like a lot of good content. We should have a whole 6 episode. And I was just thinking right now, can I propose a title for that episode?
Of course.
It's a dad joke because I'm a dad now, but are you ready for it?
Yeah.
I'm 6y and I know it. Yeah, that's gonna be the best episode just from that title alone, dog.
All right, man. Well, do we have anything more to say about this, or should we save our 6 content for said episode?
I think we'll save it.
Okay, very well.
3 more.
Your turn. Jeez, this is an exhausting episode. Lots of thinking here. We have the enthusiast.
Are you gonna even give the number, bro?
We're on 7.
We're on 7.
Dude,
Maybe
lighten up, man. I'm just trying to have fun, man. Why are you bringing down my party?
Because I'm just a hater, dog.
Yeah, bro.
I had a full bottle of
keep
hater.
Keep it fun. Keep it relaxed.
Keep it enthusiastic.
Yes, okay.
Epicurial.
So we're on type 7.
Right.
And the types are the enthusiast, the epicure, the optimist, the dreamer, the need to avoid pain, and a core motivation that centers around choice and satisfaction. What do you think?
I'm going to have to go with the enthusiast. I think the enthusiast is a great title for it.
Okay.
Not that the other ones are bad, but the 7s, almost to like an annoying fault, are enthusiastic about whatever they're doing. And if they're not enthusiastic about it, they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of encapsulates the positive and the negative. So I think enthusiast is a great name.
Fair enough.
What do you think?
I agree. Going into it a little more, I don't know. Was epicure a word in your vocabulary?
I was hoping we would kind of like skip over that because I actually don't know what it means.
Okay, good. I looked it up. So that's another thing. Like if you look it up, okay, a person who takes particular pleasure in fine food and drink.
Okay. So it's kind of like it's adjacent to gluttony.
Yes. Okay. So that's what actually I was going to bring up. I mentioned Oscar Achazo before, and the technical term passions. This is like where a type gets fixated, their passion. And the word he did have for that is gluttony. So whether it's that epicure talking pleasure, food and drink, or gluttony, that's a good point to talk about 7 with this asterisk. It's not just about food and drink. It's a more broad, overall sense experience gluttony.
Yes, I think
so
sensual is a good word, yeah.
On your phone, consuming not just food and drink, but just consuming heightened sensual, which could be sexual experience. That's part of it. So that name's all right if we take it beyond food and drink, but it has the problem of, again, not being in everyone's vocabulary. And 2, 4s also have that heightened sense, hanging out in the sense world, liking to heighten sensual experiences. So there's a little overlap there. So for those reasons, I'm not in love with Epicure.
I'm not in love with Dreamer. I think Dreamer could be 4 or 5 territory.
And I was going to say I could think it could be 3 or 9 territory.
It could be 3 or 9 territory also. It's just, and if you want to like I have a dream for society. It could kind of be kind of one-ish territory.
So
Dreamer,
Dreamer
not
just
feeling it.
not specific enough. But to teach a little bit about 7, what that might try to, a very active mental mind, brainstorming, getting excited by ideas. That is what that name probably tries to convey in relation to type 7. But yeah, there's too many other types who could fit into that category. Optimist, I also think there's too much overlap with 3.
I think so too. And the more I get to know the 7 space, it looks like optimism. It feels like optimism, but I actually don't think 7s are that optimistic.
Yeah, if I was, because it's their fear, their head type. To me, actually, I almost might. We talked about 6 being possibly a pessimist. I would almost say 3 could be the optimist of the Enneagram.
I think 3 is
always trying to rewrite the story into a positive narrative.
100.
So, so I don't love optimist there, although some surface levels of the personality could appear optimistic. Sure. But enthusiast gets to that childlike joy, that initial excitement, maybe a little of that scatteredness. Just everything's cool. I want to experience everything. I don't want to choose. Enthusiast, that does it for me.
Kid in a candy store.
Yeah.
Enthusiastic 7.
For sure.
All right. Let's move on to the next one, which is your court. Type 8. Since I'm a proper podcaster, I'm going to say the number first, so you forgot it last time.
Yeah.
Type 8. All right. The names we have are the Challenger, the Protector, the Trailblazer, the Boss, and the Confronter. Ooh, those are all 5. We have 5 again, 5 good ones. And the need to be against something is what Richard Rohr and somebody Ebert has said. And the core motivation is to be strong and to be in control. Yeah.
As a side for the Rohr thing to be against, kind of, I prefer the need to be in control if I was going to go with that realm, I think.
Yeah, I think what they're getting at is you need to be in control of something.
Yeah.
There's they have an opponent and they're going to try to control it or challenge it.
Yeah. So anyhow, we got a picture of type 8 here. You sometimes like to lead with what you like. I sometimes like to whittle down what I don't like to get at what I like. So I'm going to keep
You take the more meandering route, I think, which is cool. Let's take your route.
I guess
what are you getting rid of?
Strategy.
Yeah.
I don't like the Boss for one of the things I brought up, maybe a little too specific to a certain title, a certain position. I mean, again, if we're looking into the need to be in control, we could say, oh, bossy. It's okay. I don't love it.
You can be a strong silent type and not be bossy at all and be an 8. Right?
Yeah, or you could be a boss and not be an 8. I mean, Michael Scott, the goofball, or you could
be super bossy.
Come into the role of a boss through family and not necessarily merit. And so, I don't know. I just don't love it. Okay, another one, Trailblazer. Trailblazer speaks to innovation to me. And I'm not saying 8s can't be that, but it's not the first thing I would think about when I think of it. I think perhaps the rationale there was, I talked about 8s being rugged individualists, or, I think about conquering the wild, wild west kind of thing. I'm not sure what the rationale was for Trailblazer.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan either.
Yeah. All right. So next up, I want to discuss Protector. I think that's one of the names that speaks most largely to the healthier iteration of 8, the iteration of 8, the archetype that has integrated the 2 component and is not just the every man for himself, but has a little more virtue and responsibility. And of course, you could say lower level 8s are protecting their ego, or they're protecting their need to appear strong,
or
and
their
that's
sovereignty or
some
something.
of this aggression is coming from. But in my archetypal scheme, again, the 3-tiered one, I call the highest 8 the gracious protector, to try to get at what I was saying. But it doesn't speak to enough of the general 8ness for me. So that leaves the challenger and the confronter. And they're pretty similar, but to me, the distinction there is, again, a matter of health. I feel challenger works across the board. You can be aggressively challenging, or you can be creatively challenging. You can be skillfully challenging. You can be playful challenging. You can be all types of challenging that unhealthy 8s can challenge, average 8s can challenge, healthy 8s can challenge, and there's just a room for challenging, and that's what 8 kind of does. Whereas confronter seems a little more narrow to like an arrogant assuredness. It seems a little more limited.
Yeah. If I had to pick one, I think I would agree with you that challenger is my favorite here. But this one, of all the list of names of all these numbers, I actually think doesn't do the 8 justice. And it's because there's like, even challenger, again, I'm thinking of like kind of an archetype that would be an 8, an archetypal 8 that's not a challenger is, I mentioned it earlier, is kind of like the strong silent type, or like the maybe like the cowboy, the American cowboy, I think kind of has an 8 vibe. And although they can and will challenge when a confrontation shows up in their path, like they don't go looking for it, and they're perfectly content to not. It's kind of like, look, no one's going to mess with me, but I don't really need to be bossing anyone around, like that kind of vibe. And so that's why even challenger kind of speaks to like maybe an overly aggressive nature that I don't think 8s need to have. I would maybe pitch something like in the realm of the sovereign, the kind of independent, and even those aren't really good at getting it across. I can only use maybe like I can describe it in a number of words, but not a single word. It's kind of just like being autonomous, and in control of yourself, and that doesn't need to exactly need an opponent or a challenge to be that. Would you agree, or is it always relational? Are 8s always kind of defining themselves against something else?
I think you're describing.
I'm describing 8-wing 9.
An exception to the rule, maybe.
Really? Okay. Well, I maybe it's just. I
think challenging is going to come across at some point. How? Yeah, I don't know. No, I like what you said. I don't want to quite diminish it at that point. The exception to the rule. But.
Okay, but yeah, I think I have just some issues with it, but it's still pretty good. I think challenger, for all intents and purposes, can and should be used to describe the 8.
Yeah.
So,
but I think you brought up some good points there for means of clarification against some of those stereotypes that could arise out of the name. So that was a good thing to do.
Okay, I think we're on to the last.
All right.
Last but not least.
And another time we're going to have to do this in not the 1 through 9 numerical order. So 9s just aren't always at the last.
Poor 9s.
Yes.
I love 9s.
All right. So we have the Peacemaker, the Mediator, the Connector, the Preservationist, out of Roar's Christian perspective, the need to avoid, and a core motivation that centers around harmony and stability. So what do you think here?
This one, I think I'm trying to look for nuance in it, but I think Peacemaker is just rising to the top for me.
Yeah.
Mediator is okay. Connector, I think, could be associated too much with the 2. And Preservationist, to preserve, kind of, I think that can kind of get into 6 territory a little bit. It could be
the guardian idea. Yeah.
But Peacemaker, I said this before and I'll say it again. I love 9s, and it's basically because they're easy to be around, and that's kind of their forte, is like they just like peaceful, chill vibes. And sometimes, I think a lot of times, at their own expense. I think they put their own kind of instincts and their own,
For sure.
but for everyone else, it's like they're really hard to dislike because what they bring to the table is a lot of peace, and I love peace. Maybe some eights and sevens would dislike nines because they're into to kind of get off on a little
Like,
bit
have
of
an opinion, man.
Come on,
Say something. Yeah.
Let's start a fight. But
Yeah.
for those of us who are more into the chill vibes, I think nines are great, and it's because they're peacemakers.
Yeah, I like what you said about the connector possibly being confused with the heart type 2, or in some cases 3. Peacemaker and mediator are similar. I like Peacemaker. Well, for one, it has that big buzzword of 9 in it, peace.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives the edge to me for that. I thought about preservationist a little more, and why I don't know that I'm willing to I'm going to talk about it.
I think I know where you're going to go with this, and I agree already. Does it have to do with nature?
Not only that. Okay.
Well, could I guess? I thought you were gonna go. We both think that nines they're just tend to be nature people
For sure.
and they're just like their profile pictures are always like them in a park, or like them with
or
like
just the park,
or just the trees.
sky.
Yeah.
I mean, not even them necessarily.
And so like I could see preservation, like nature preservation, being a great 9 career.
Fair enough. That's not where I was going, but again, that's a great point and association to bring up in association with point 9. Where I was going was, one of the things I find maybe a little lacking in names like Peacemaker and Mediator is they do feel like roles, like the peacemaker between two opposing sides, or certainly the mediator speaks to that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't, but that's not always how that shows up. For 9, it's really that desire to have peace that, as Rohr pointed out, can look like avoidance. Like, I avoid confrontation because I want to maintain some inner balance and harmony. So maybe being the peacemaker between two sides who have different opinions, or the mediator, actually is a very highly confrontational thing that I want to avoid. So I'm the preservationist. I want to preserve my own sense of balance and harmony. So that's where I think preservationist in that sense can make you appreciate that avoidance thing that Rohr is speaking to. Like, I'm avoiding conflict or confrontation because I don't want to get off put. I don't want to feel uncomfortable.
Right.
So
when you describe it like that, I'm more on board with that.
So preservationist, to me, in ways some of the other names don't work, it can describe the inner reality of I'm avoiding to try to preserve my own peace or harmony. Or the preservationist can be someone who's like, I care about preserving nature, or even I care about preserving this group's dynamic of peace and harmony. So now I'm willing, in the healthier version of 9, I'm willing to take on a little conflict and play the peacemaker or the mediator because I'm willing to try to mend these opposing viewpoints where we can all find a common ground. So I think we haven't really given the Hurley-Dobson names a lot of love.
I know. I've been a hater on all of them. I've hated on a number.
The preservationist wins me over a bit when I think of it like that.
Okay. And when you described it like that, I tend to agree. It just initially sounded like some six vibes.
Yeah. It needs some asterisk. Peacemaker is probably the best no explanation name for 9, but with an asterisk, I kind of like preservationist.
I've also heard like harmonizer, but that's it's like they typically, and I like that because they it implies that there's like if we're going to use a music term, it implies there's like a melody first, and then they come in second and respond to it with like a harmony.
Oh,
right?
I like that.
Which is because it's like you rarely see 9s just come in with their own melody, unless they're a healthy type, in which case they do.
I like that. I don't know that I've I've probably come across it, but it hasn't like registered with me. But I like that. I also like for like the peacemaker mediator. It kind of speaks to that roles, but it's a little more abstract. So it's not like, oh, they're the mediator at the table, between two parties. Like you could see that with the harmonizer, but it's a little more abstract. So it invites you to kind of imagine other roles other than just the boardroom mediator.
Right.
Cool.
The HR person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Toby.
Toby from The Office.
Yeah.
Poor Toby.
He's probably a 9. I don't know.
Toby's
or maybe
totally,
a 4. Maybe a 4. I don't know. I have to watch the.
Toby's a kind of an unhealthy 9.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Well,
it was long. We got in depth, but I think we did pretty good.
Yeah.
Let us know what you think.
Yeah.
Let us know what you think. Everyone, check us out, and we totally want to hear. Did we
I don't
makes
think,
any sense at all?
Yeah, I don't think this one we have to, sometimes those videos do like fish for comments. Like, I don't really care what you think, but let us know what you think. So you leave some YouTube comments. It's like, I'm sure this one, a lot of people are going to have opinions and their own opinions about what the best name is. So let's hear them. Let's hear them. I'm genuinely curious.
Yeah, me too. Because this is very open to interpretation, as we've just seen ourselves.
All right. Awesome.
Sweet. Fist bump.